and welcome to the Blockleaders podcast with me, Gillian Gottsell. Today, I'm delighted to have as my guest Michael Casey. You have a lot of labels after your name. You're a journalist, you're a public speaker, author, educator, and you're also chairman of DAIS, the Decentralized AI Society. Which comes first, Michael? Which label would you like to put on first? Oh, public
I
speaker.
suppose I say journalist. I mean, I think at heart I've always been, and that's where my roots are. And so, the soul of a journalist. But I don't really do journalism in its truest form these days. I think. I mean, I still write and produce content. I don't even quite know what we would define as journalism necessarily these days in a very disrupted kind of environment that we live in for media. Um, and I think part of the struggle is that I don't quite know how to define who I am anymore as a job, which I'm not bothered about because I don't think it matters that much. But that's why I think I have a variety of different labels after my name.
Well, I suppose it's nice you can do them all. So these are things that you're actively
I,
doing.
I don't know if it's a case of doing them all at once or more just like I'm just struggling to find a definition, but it is what it is.
Well, actually, interesting. When I was early on in my career, I started off as a system analyst, but then I moved into fintech PR. And I used to always say, "Don't let my tombstones have PR on the." No, I can't have it. I'm doing like a Spike Milligan, what you want, kind me, grab a brooch. I said I was sick. So when I actually call myself a journalist now, because and I've taken the move over, and
Oh,
writer,
yeah.
because that's what my
Yes.
passion is.
Okay.
So isn't it funny how you.
Storyteller is private too, by the way. Storyteller.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yes, yes. Well, and that's what we're going to do in this conversation because rather than just quiz you about your hugely successful career, CoinDesk, MIT, and we will talk about your most recent company because it's relevant. I discovered when looking over at your CV and stuff like that and doing a bit of stalking that you have written six books, and six very interesting ones.
Yeah. I'm a masochist, I think. Yes.
You must be because it's not as though you sit in an attic and scratch away at a piece of paper
I
or.
literally am in an attic, by the way, that my office is in the attic. And so that I am in an attic. So your
Okay.
premise is on that level.
I take that back. Okay, you are an addict, but you do many things as discussed already. So it's not as if you give yourself the freedom to devote all your time to writing. So that's why I'm so impressed. But the first one you
Well,
said
thank
it
you.
was the most fun one, and it's an interesting subject. It's Che Guevara, but it's not the man; it's his image.
That's right. That's right. So the title is Che's Afterlife for a reason, right? Che died in 1967. Obviously, an influential human being in the world. He was sort of, Cuban revolutionary, but actually an Argentine by birth. But when I was living in Argentina at the time, which is why I ended up sort of pursuing it. But he died in 1967, but he kind of had this afterlife because the myth, the iconography, the imagery, especially tied to one specific photo of him by a guy called Alberto Corda, ended up having a very, I would argue an even bigger impact than the man had on the world, but very different from many respects what his intent would have been and everything else. And so the book is really an exploration of how you know, a range of trends in society around in the 1960s, and also technologies around art and screen printing and everything else, um, ended up sort of transforming something that was a kind of a real life human being who had all the complexity of what that was, and transformed it into this bromide, this two-toned, just black and white flat image that then became a vehicle for what I have essentially said was a brand, right? But it's a brand that could mean anything for anybody. And it's a kind of a precursor to the modern world of marketing in many respects. And that's a kind of from a perspective on Che Guevara as this hard-nosed, revolutionary communist, to say that he became a brand was kind of like antithetical to certain people on the left, and also some people on the right saw it as like me sort of diminishing all of what they saw as his sins. I was just interested in the phenomenon of what it was that led to this massively reproduced image. Because it was ubiquitous in Argentina when I was there at the time, and the left was resurgent, and they were just holding up the Che image to somehow say whatever it was they were trying to say about what they wanted to resurge through. And I was just very interested in what led to that, and how do we get here. And it ended up being an exploration of a whole range of things, from copyright laws to 1960s hippie movement to a variety of factors. So I had a lot of fun. I traveled around Latin America. I went looking for Che all over the world. And yeah, as I said, by far the most enjoyable book I've read, just because that was a fun thing to do. And I still try to figure out how it fits into the series of everything else that I did. But I think there are some through lines that make some sense.
Well, it's before you'd come across Bitcoin and blockchain, presumably, or had you? Because it's 2009.
No, it definitely was. It was before Bitcoin was even invented. I mean, it was published in 2009, so yes, Bitcoin had been released at that point. But I mean, it was written and researched really through 2006 to 2008, and Bitcoin, the white paper was October 31st, 2008. So yeah, it was certainly before I was had any idea around it, but living in Argentina was a major factor in me discovering Bitcoin, which I can get into.
Wow. Well,
It
would you
was
want to say it now? And because your next book we're going to look at is the unfair trade.
right.
So
Also,
yeah.
the lessons there contributed. So yes, I mean, I was, and I think, uh, as I said, Che was inspired by living in Argentina at a time when the left was resurgent, and it was a. But my point was that this wasn't the left of the 60s. This wasn't the sort of like the guerrillas of Latin America. It was more this kind of like very branded marketing, sort of like 21st century idea of what left wing politics would be. This was Lula in Brazil and everything else. So that was what interested me in that. Um, and Argentina was caught up in its own financial crisis. I was a financial journalist for a very long time, and so really I was really thinking about that, the economics. But then went from the financial crisis of Argentina that basically spent 6 years covering, because the aftermath of it defined, this was even bigger than the current crisis. This was 2003, but I was there for the subsequent 6 years, and the aftermath of it and figuring it out was the big story of Argentina. But then by the time I got back to New York in 2009, I was, of course, in the middle of an even bigger crisis, and it was the global financial crisis. Um, and that was really striking because I'd spent so much time wondering about why Argentina was such a screw up. This very wealthy country from terms of resource and everything else. A long history. It was one of the very, very richest countries in the world at the end of the 20th, the 19th century. And then 100 years later, it was, in this deep crisis, and it still is really. How it could go with all this opportunity into this mess was a study of the failure of its institutions, the failure of its democracy, the failure of its capacity to actually forge a system of trust amongst its people. And I was obsessed with that and trying to wonder what, because if you can, like, I think it was Foucault said that if you can understand the mind of a madman, you can understand what, a human mind, what the sanity is, right? We can define the normal by the abnormal.
Yeah.
And I think Argentina is a lesson in understanding how institutions work by looking at how they don't work, right? And then all of a sudden you go to the United States, the place that was the institutional capital of money, of finance, of a trusted sort of democratic market system, and it was in an absolute crisis. And so, it was very interesting to think, okay, what is it now? This is a more fundamental problem here about how we trust each other. What are our institutions, and are those institutions acting in our interests? And why, if they are now not doing so, are they not doing so? And I think where I landed, because most of my work up until then had been very much looking at global phenomenon. I'd lived in Indonesia, I'd lived in Argentina. I used to write a lot about emerging markets, and sort of when I was in Argentina, I spent half of my time writing about the IMF and the G7 that Argentina was like constantly in battle with for ages over a gigantic debt restructuring. Um, and so I was always thinking about this international phenomenon. And so I looked at the GFC, as Aussies like to call it, the global financial crisis, as a global phenomenon. We think of it as beginning on Wall Street, but really it was all the imbalances that had been created in the world with the rise of China and the massive sort of distortions in the flow of money and capital, and I tried to show how this should matter to the average person. So the unfair trade was all about linking the stories of individuals who were kind of victims of the crisis or were in some way being affected by it, be it the guy who was up to his eyeballs in debt in a um you know here in the US in some sort of housing problem, to a factory worker in Shanghai, to these kids that were being sort of like opening up these holes in the ground in Peru to try to dig up gold because the gold price was soaring, right? And so drawing the linkages between these phenomena and what it meant for daily people's lives to show that we're all in this together. That's what the unfair trade is all about, to show that we actually have an interest in somehow trying to look at these in the age of globalization, which, if I go back to Che, was a story about globalization in some respects. We've ended up with these distortions, and we need some sort of system that was more uniform than this very distorted hegemonic US dollar model. Um, and so I became interested in the sort of centrality of the U.S. financial system and the international monetary system that's built on that. And that's what really the unfair trade was all about, trying to unpack that big macro story, but show folks at the ground level how it actually impacts ordinary people's lives, and we need to be thinking about these bigger things.
Yeah, I love the subhead, and it speaks to me personally how broken global financial systems destroys the middle class. I was in the middle of my
Yeah.
own destroying bit. Banks took my home,
You were,
stuff in
well,
Ireland.
Ireland was a huge part of the problem, and in
Yeah.
fact, I addressed Ireland in the book. I didn't get to travel there, unfortunately, at the time, but I mean,
Oh,
it's a big part of the story. Yeah.
because we had the Celtic Tiger, and then we had the
Right.
crash. We
Yeah.
felt it worse, and it was
But
really
it
bad.
did a very good job of recovering, which is very interesting, I think,
Well,
in
that's another whole
retrospect.
story.
No,
We'll
no,
see
it
what
wasn't
Trump
as
does to
easy as
us.
that. Yeah,
But what was
exactly.
interesting is the budget's destroying the middle class because I became a raving accidental activist because my home was taken and
Right.
my business collapsed, and then
Yeah,
banks refused to let me sell my house. I had to
yeah,
they repossessed it, and I had to go as the first female bankrupt under the new laws in Ireland. But I'm a raving activist at this stage, and then I changed the
yeah.
law because bankrupts were not allowed to run for public office in Ireland. We inherited from the UK, so I changed the law
Mm.
and I ran in the European parliamentary elections in 2014. But one of the things that I was banging on about was that when you destroy the middle class,
Hmm.
it's the glue, and then we all
That's
know
it.
how
Yeah,
the
yeah.
the money goes like this. It's up here, and then there isn't a
Well,
middle.
we have not fixed the middle
No,
class. No, I mean Ireland recovered, but the middle class necessarily didn't. But the United States is probably a stronger example of the impact of that, right? I mean, there is no way that you can, no matter where you sit on the political divide, which is in itself a massive problem, the very, very divisive nature of politics in the United States or in elsewhere for that matter. No matter where you sit on either side of that divide, the decimation of the middle class is the explanation for the political phenomenon that we're dealing with right now. Like Trump would not at all have anywhere near the power that he has if you had this sort of stability of the middle class in the way that we did have,
Mm.
20 years ago.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's,
No.
it's frightening. And then, and it's interesting because for you, as I say, you're a financial journalist. I'm being hit with all this stuff, and I start to question what is money. Up until then, I wouldn't have given it any thought. You just something you go out
Yeah.
and you earn it, whatever. And your next book then is like 2015, The Age of Cryptocurrency. Now that's where it gets.
Yeah.
So tell me about when you first heard about Bitcoin. Why it grabbed you, or did it not only happen in 2015 or a little bit before? I was going to write the book. What was that like?
Yeah, no, it was 2013, I was still writing about the fallout from the crisis because if you remember, we went from the global financial crisis to the European crisis, and there was, I was running the foreign exchange coverage for the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones at the time, and I used to write a regular column, and the Cyprus crisis had happened,
Mm,
and the banks there had whacked a 10% withdrawal tax on everybody, and people were up in arms, and suddenly Bitcoin started rising, and I didn't know what Bitcoin was, and I thought, what? How does this? What is this? How does this work? And we just so it was suddenly seeing and then getting your head around. Oh, so people see this as an alternative to the banking system, and having written at length about the broken banking system, which was really a key part of what the unfair trade was about, a key part of what the financial system was about, and also was in some respects a through line from from Argentina because again it was all about the lack of trust in the financial institutions that was the story not just of Argentina's 2003 crisis, but really of its persistent 100-year breakdown. The failure of trust is the core problem. In you can't have a financial system, which means you can't have a contemporary fractional reserve banking based currency system, which is what we have if you don't have trust. And so seeing that breakdown of trust in a place like Cyprus and seeing it manifested in this alternative of Bitcoin was suddenly very interesting. Why? What the hell is this thing? And so I wrote a column that was not very well informed, but wasn't wrong. It was just like questioning what the hell is it sort of thing. And I got a call from Jeremy Allaire, who now is a very big figure in the world of crypto,
Careful.
is behind Circle, and took me out for dinner along with a few other journalists. And at that dinner was Barry Silbert, who ended up for forming the digital currency group not long after that, ended up owning CoinDesk, which I ended up being a player in for a number of years. And Barry and I have known each other ever since and stayed in touch for a long time. Barry was there. He was there. There was Mickey Malka from an investor, a VC. There was a guy called Raj Date who had just finished his job as the head of, believe it or not, Elizabeth Warren's CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Board,
Okay.
he basically took over from her, and then he left, and now he was into Bitcoin. And there was a number of other people there, and I was like, wow, these are people who've got a history of successful investment. They're not just wackos on the edge of fringe of society. And they basically laid out to me the case. And I think it was Barry. I wish I could remember exactly if it was Barry or Jeremy. One of the two said to me, "You were in Argentina, weren't you, Michael?" And I was like, "Yes." He says, "Well, can you imagine if rather than having to trust this perennially broken system where the government has to keep devaluing its currency to try to pay for its taxes, as nobody's paying its taxes and nobody's is trusting the currency, and you're stuck in this vicious cycle. There was a monetary system that was dependent on math, and it didn't have to have these fallible corrupt institutions in the middle of it." And I went mind blown, because that was the thing I'd been, obsessed with for like, almost a decade. And no, it was a decade. And it's just, wow, what a concept that money could be something. And then that course, to your question or your point earlier, immediately leads you to, well, what is money? Because I was thinking it's not really money, it's this other thing. But then you start to, well, no, money is nothing but an expression of faith and trust anyway. It always is, whether it's gold or dollars or anything. It is always that we and you and I have a compact between us that we will accept it as money. Where does that come from? And what is the roots of that is a really important question. Because people talk about it in absolute terms as if it is like, it is, well, yes. But as Yuval Harari says, it's a story. It's a very good story. And we shouldn't diminish the relevance of stories. Saying something as a story doesn't make it any less important. In fact, it makes it all the more powerful. To his point, human ingenuity and civilization is actually an expression of the greatest skill that we have, which is to tell stories that we all believe in and construct our own realities around those and build systems around that. Whether it's democracy, the idea of a corporation, all of these are stories. So money is a story. The greatest story ever told is the way he puts it. And when you realize that, you're like, well, yeah, why couldn't it be Bitcoin, or why couldn't it be anything else? And then it just comes down to, okay, what's its functionality? Does it work well? And it does. It works really well. I mean, Bitcoin functions. It's amazing that it just keeps going and going and going, and there is nobody in charge. I mean, that to me is, when people sometimes say, like, why does Bitcoin matter? I'll just say, look, forget whether you think it's useful or not. It is. I'm telling you it is. But just to move that and just contemplate the very fact that this thing of value that a lot of people, whether you believe it or not, have poured a chunk of money into, which means they are really trusting this system with a massive amount of money, that thing is continuing to go every day without anybody in charge. That's an incredible idea. That is one of the most powerful ideas that you could ever conceive of in humanity. When you get to that point, you then start to go, "Wow, what else could we do with this?" Right? So that's what the Age of Crypto was. It was a Age of Cryptocurrency. I co-wrote that with my colleague Paul Vigna, and started then a history of co-writing books. And Paul and I, yeah, we went down that rabbit hole and became the two crazies in the newsroom.
Yes, yes, you
you
are. I
know,
mean, I even found today, well, it's getting less and less, but a lot of my friends will say, "You still enough funny money? You know, the
yeah, yeah.
magic beans." I'm kind of going,
No,
And no matter how much I say to them, quantitative easing, they go, no,
Yeah.
no, it's funny money. Isn't it hard? Because I guess it challenges people. It makes them, it's
Well,
not the status quo. Is that what it is? It's scary. It's change scary?
yes, I think that is, but it's also I think it's that's a it's even deeper than that. It is exactly that. Change is scary, but what is it that we're changing? As I said, Harari talks about money being the greatest story ever told. So this system of money that we have, this fiat system, this sovereign idea, this goes way back, right? And some economists will, many economists will tell you that you can't have money without government is money in some way, right? And that may be the case, but then Bitcoin can be a form of governance, and so maybe that's our substitute for that idea. But either way, this is a very deeply entrenched idea. So when you're actually sort of challenging people's fundamental beliefs, which is just a story, but it's a deep one, right? Think of the very powerful way that people certainly when the depth of beliefs in religion, right? Galileo was was put in shackles and sent off like for sort of challenging these fundamental tenets of Christianity. Um, People don't think of money as a religion, but it is, right? It is a belief system, and you're challenging that very core idea. So I think that's where it comes from. It deeper than just change. It's like this is doesn't fit with the way my whole structural understanding of value is, right? Money is value, and value is how we like put a sense of understanding the world.
Mm.
So yeah, it's hard for people, and I've always that's what I say to people. People say, well, Bitcoin's already been around for 10 years and it hasn't really ever had the impact that it has. Well, I first of all would challenge that. I think it has had enormous tangential impact on the world. It changes. I mean, it really was a factor, you could argue, and not just argue. I think it's pretty clear that it was in the US election that just passed, right? Enormously important.
Sure.
But beyond that, it's worth saying that anything that is going to we're not overturning. This isn't like the bicycle, like the motor car overturning the horse or the bicycle, this is overturning a 400-year-old deeply entrenched system of power, right? So 10 years is a tiny period to put that system to the test. If gold became a form of money and a belief system out of nothing, because gold is nothing but a representation, it doesn't have any function. It has an intrinsic value. Um, that didn't happen overnight. Like we don't know, in fact, how gold became money. Um, but my guess is it didn't happen overnight, right? It developed deeply over time because of the way these things work, and so
Maybe
so
be
so I think it's
also
unfair to hold Bitcoin
durable.
to a 10-year standard,
Mm.
basically.
Mm. No, I think it's cool. And interestingly, are you following Lieberland?
Oh, I am, yeah. I am now. Didn't you have a role there or something? Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Congresswoman.
yeah,
And I'm Secretary
yeah,
of Culture.
exactly.
But it's interesting because
Yeah, yeah,
that's built on blockchain. And they're using
yeah,
blockchain as
yeah,
governance and
yeah.
it's not without its interesting quirks. There are
Yeah,
obviously,
yeah. No,
it's
no,
quite
of course.
interesting,
But
but
it's
it's
an interesting, like, I think it's a very interesting way to at least have these conversations, right?
yeah.
About like where does power come from? What is money? What is
Mm.
rights? Like, how do you define the rights of citizens and everything else? Yeah, yeah,
No, it's fascinating. So then tell me the next book, The Social Organism. You're looking at social media and social
yeah.
platforms as a biological system. Explain that.
Yeah. Probably the one that was the biggest diversion in some respects, but actually then end up bringing me full circle to where I end up at the end of the process. But I mean, I had left the Wall Street Journal in 2015 because I felt like, as I said, I was the crazy in the newsroom
Crazy
along
man.
with Paul, and I was all that the journal wanted me to do was like find Satoshi, which really wasn't anywhere near the most interesting story to tell. And then I was very lucky to get an invite to go to MIT, where I was one of the founding staffers under Brian Ford, who'd worked in the Obama administration, um, to head up the digital currency initiative there. And that was a lot of fun. And I learned very different skill sets, got around these nerdy, math genius folks in the lab and did a lot of work around research and everything else. Um, but ultimately discovered that I'm not really made for academia, I don't think, as much as I enjoyed that. I actually co-taught a class with at Sloan as well, the management school there, with Simon Johnson, who was thrilled to discover a matter of a few months ago was given the Nobel Prize in economics. So that was a huge privilege. So I had a lot of fun, but at the end of the day, people started to realize, well, what's Casey's skill? He can just tell a good story. He can talk and he can write. And so I found myself being kind of like the de facto spokesperson for MIT DCI, the Digital Currency Initiative. And MIT used to roll me out and go on these trips so I could impress um, uh, their guys with money that fund the university. And it was a lot of fun, but I didn't feel like I was doing research really necessarily. And one of the things I was interested in was, I was involved in, I'd met a guy called Oliver Luckett when I was, and this is going to sound ridiculously privileged, but I'd spent a few every year at the Blockchain Summit at Necker Island, Richard Branson's
Ooh.
ridiculously exclusive resort, sort of paid for, thankfully, by somebody else. But that's when I met Oliver there, who had been invited along with me at that summit, and he was a very interesting guy who had a view on social media that was quite different from anything I'd heard, um, where he explained this idea of memes and the sort of like expansion of these networks of human beings through the lens of biology and it really became, in some respects, it does tie back to a lot of what I've done because it really was about system design, networks, and how they function. As I tell people, I really feel like my work over the years can be summarized as being at the intersection of, where technology and money meet society. And see these networks that are really the source of power, right? I mean, the big magnificent seven, and I like to call them the malignant seven, the gigantic platforms that really rule our lives. We've never seen anything like this level of power monetarily or politically, I would say, than what those gigantic internet platforms hold over us. That is a network effect, right? That is an expression of how the spread of interconnected lives actually has the most powerful value in the world. And so, you know, um, how that spreads is what Oliver was interested in. And he looks at memes in the same way we look at genetic change and evolution, these forces through life that are sort of fractal-like effects, right? And it was a great way to describe memes and things like that, that then ultimately, have become such an important part of the way we understand social media, but also crypto, I would say, which, clearly meme culture is very, very
I was going to say,
relevant
Shay
to.
was your first meme, was he?
And Che was the first meme, and there you go. You go right back to Che because Che was absolutely the ultimate meme. Yeah, exactly. So that was just a really interesting exercise to sort of go down a different thought process. I helped he came to me with the book idea, and we ran with it. We were trying to make the point that then very early, I think, because I wasn't that was when I first got obsessed, I think, with what had happened to media. I'd seen this profession that I had been involved in for so long just lose its way. And the early days of the internet journalism, we were saying, oh yeah, the biggest threat to journalism is this blogger that can, this citizen blogger. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, that's true. My privileged position as a relatively well-paid journalist at a publisher like the Wall Street Journal, it could be challenged by this new competition, but my guilty mind would say, but isn't that a good thing that there's competition and there's other voices and so forth? And so I didn't know what to do with it. But then I realized as I was writing blogs and doing podcasts and then being asked to tweet and then being asked to do LinkedIn posts and then realizing that I was putting out 5 posts a day. And then I was also writing stories for the paper and that my entire job was desperately trying to get eyeballs to keep going back to us rather than disappearing out into the ether. That in fact, our competition was not those bloggers, it was Facebook's algorithm and the sort of scourge of modern journalism in my mind is SEO,
No,
search engine optimization,
meet your
which
sister.
is
I refuse to
right.
understand it. I refuse to.
Well, good for you because I mean it is unfortunately a fundamental feature of Web 2 journalism. You really can't survive if your business model is built around advertising without it. But it is horrible because the algorithm changes all the time. You don't know what's underneath it. This is Google. Um, and at the end of the day, you're writing for an algorithm, right? You should be writing for your audience. I want to interact with you, my reader, not with you indirectly via actually making the algorithm happy, which has all of its alternative interests, right? That it doesn't care about us, me, or the reader. It cares about its own advertising and other dollars, not my advertisers, but its advertisers, right? So there's a absolute destruction of our information system that came at that moment, and the social media organism was a way to look at that because we were trying to make the case that we needed to open these algorithms up and let people see what they were doing, because if they didn't, we this mimetic process was all running on its own, but it was being directed by these algorithms into really quite dangerous ways, which will bring us back to my sixth book when we get there in a moment. But
Yeah.
so I just really at that point became quite obsessed with what we later would define as Web 2 and the very broken nature of that. I absolutely believe this is the core problem of society right now, is that our information system is utterly broken, and we need to fix it, especially as we move into the AI world.
That's all those silos and all the things that come with it is frightening. Okay, now next on the truth machine. This is better than this is your life. The truth machine, blockchain and the future of everything.
Yeah, and
Fine.
that was really, in some respects, that just became because we'd published a book. The Age of Cryptocurrency was quite successful. That was with St. Martin's Press, and our editor came to Paul and I and said, "Well, isn't there another thing happening now with all these other new developments, right?" And sure, there was an enormous amount of explosive activity. The Ethereum had been invented, and there was smart contracts for this, and enterprise solutions for that, and everything was all out there. So we did an update in a way. That's what it was. In the Truth Machine, it was a controversial title. Some people said it should be called the Trust Machine, which would have been viable. But what I was trying to say with Truth Machine was, look, at the end of the day, it is about how do we arrive at a consensus view of what it is, and that ultimately that's what this is. Like this is a blockchain is an exercise in all agreeing that the state, the ledger, is what we all agree it to be. And if you don't believe it, you can go off and fork. And other people believe that, you'll go and build a fork on the blockchain as a result of that. So it was a provocative title because some people say, well, there is this absolute truth, and I was saying, you know what, that may be the case. I want to believe there is an absolute truth. I think there is, but for the purposes of how we negotiate with ourselves in society and how we agree to get back to Harari on the same story, is that we need a common truth that we all agree on. Not that is absolute, but that we can all say, this is what a house is, right? This is what constitutes, so GDP, like what is the GDP of Ireland, right? Well, there is an official number that's out there, but it's like how accurate is it? Like you could never actually properly measure GDP. There's no absolute truth to that. It would be a literally impossible thing to nail down.
And it leaves
So we
loads
have
out.
right, but we have systems for estimating it, and we have a bunch of economy, we have a bunch of rules and standards, and we agree that that's the standard that we use, right? That's how most of what we do works. We all have an agreement around a standard that gets recognized as the truth. And so blockchain is a way to do that without relying on a central arbiter of truth. It's not the bank telling you what is true or the government. It's a collective interest in what that is. So I just thought there was a provocative way to think about it, and then once you go from that, you can start to say, okay, so a blockchain it's a data structure, right? It enables money, and because money relies upon a data structure, it relies on a ledger. A ledger is the foundational element of society. If you go right back to the beginnings of civilization, Mesopotamia, the Sumerian tablets famously recognized, the beginnings of writing all start with a ledger, right? A common truth that we can all agree on is the basis upon which we can then enter into exchange. So money and value comes out of that. But then you start to realize that everything starts to rely on this commonality of what we recognize it to be. So a blockchain is a mechanism to do all sorts of things, right? So that's really what the book's about. We're exploring that from that perspective, all the different ways in which we can use this way in which society grapples with the coordination around ideas and facts, which is, everywhere you go, there is a centralized or some sort of institution that is helping these otherwise untrusting entities interact with each other by giving them a common standard with which to work with, whether it's trustees or whatever, right? So a blockchain is a different way of managing that doesn't rely on that centralized entity in the middle, and it's very revolutionary in what it could do, is what the point of the book was.
Mhm. Cool. No, I love it. Okay, then your last book, before we talk about your current project, which is all tied in together, and this is interesting too as well. Our biggest fight, reclaiming liberty, humanity, and dignity in the digital age. That's a lot of things to reclaim.
Yeah, but don't you think they're important, right? And
Mm.
interesting. Even the word liberty is a good one, I think, because and this is where Frank McCourt. This is another book that was brought to me by somebody else. So Frank came to me, and I'd met Frank in Davos, actually, at the he was putting on an event there with Polkadot, and he really was the very first mainstream businessman I had met who really understood what I was obsessed with, which was this broken information system, this Web 2 destruction of our models of confidence and truth and trust. And uh, so Frank and I hit it off. And then a couple of years later, weirdly, the editor of the social organism said, "Hey, I have this client who's looking to find a partner to write a book with. And I really like what you did with Oliver. So I think you'd be a good person for this. His name's Frank McCourt." Like, oh my God, Frank!
My
And by the way,
friend,
to the Irish listeners out there, of course, this is not the probably more famous Frank McCourt.
that I
Uh,
had to double check it, but I was looking at it, I was going,
Writing a book with that
matches.
Frank McCourt was the achievement, because Angela Asse's author
Mm.
and Nobel Prize winner, Frank McCourt, is no longer with us. But this Frank McCourt is very much alive, and he's a very successful person in his own right, a billionaire that made his money in building. And that's actually an interesting take, because Frank had come to view, through some of his experiences, the internet and its sort of capacity for weaponization, social media. I mean, I think British listeners will perhaps relate, if they can think back to Brexit and Cambridge Analytica and so forth, and understand that these systems become quite powerfully manipulated. And Frank sort of saw that, and then thought about his role as somebody who's built infrastructure, and the strict building codes, and the fact that you build things that have to meet these standards, that you have to be, the people who live in those buildings have to know that they are safe, and you don't build them to manipulate them. They don't you don't they're not the residents are not there so that the building can exploit them and sort of spit them out and turn them into whatever they want them to be. That it's a service. You are serving these customers, right? And anybody would know Bruce Schneier's famous line about Facebook, right? That you are not Facebook's customer, you are Facebook's product, will know where I'm going here. That is the core problem. We build a system where the incentives of the owners of our platforms were not treating us as customers. We're not there they don't care whether or not we're actually solving problems and that their technology is useful to us. They care that our eyeballs, our attention are being directed toward whatever money making exercises they have. And if they can do that surreptitiously through some subliminal thing or whatever, it doesn't matter, right? So that is a broken system, because at the end of the day, our information system is our democracy. We don't have a functioning society. It gets back to the truth, right? The truth machine. Like, if we cannot have a system in which we're literally able to decide on what the truth is, we're in a problem. And I think that one of the books that, before I wrote this one with Frank, that really influenced me at the time was Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, which I recommend everybody read. And it was this moment when I realized, holy crap, we are already in the matrix. And she makes the point, and I will fight to the death anybody who disputes this, that we have lost our free will, because human beings have an enormous capacity to exaggerate their abilities to decide for themselves. We're actually really vulnerable because we have a bunch of chemicals in our brains. We all know about dopamine. And anybody that studies addiction, and there's a woman that we quote in Our Biggest Fight called Anna Lemke, who does a great job of explaining this because she studied narcotics for years, knows that it's a really hard thing to fight, right? The addiction stuff. But an addict knows that they are addicted. An addict knows that it's the cocaine that is driving them to constantly, and then, or rather, their own chemical imbalance and their need for that cocaine that gets them to keep snorting lines. The social media user doesn't know that inside those algorithms, and she's Daniel MK calls social media and the iPhones that they sit upon as a hypodermic needle in our pocket. So an entire business model created around getting us to do a lot of stuff that we don't think we do, that we think we're in control and we are not. That is the way the system is built. Can you think of any? That's why we call it our biggest fight. There is nothing more important, right? The only way we can actually forge a functioning society is to have a common ground of truth, in which, yes, we can argue to the death amongst ourselves and decide what we want, but we have to at least know what we're talking about. And we have to have the capacity to make decisions on our own free will. You can't have a democracy and you can't have a market. You can't have a free market if people can't decide what they actually want to buy and what. That's what the market is based upon. So decisions about what things to build, what things not to build, decisions on what to invest in, decisions on what, all of that is being distorted by algorithms that are serving the very narrow interest, which is why those seven companies are worth $17 trillion. They control everything, right? It is so patently clear to me that we have created an absolutely broken system of capitalism and an absolutely broken democracy because of these systems. Our biggest fight. There is nothing more important that we can fix than this. Now, this is where it does lead us out of the books into where I am now. Because if we've, and look, the studies that have shown how many, adolescents that have died as a result of being driven down rabbit holes, is the divisiveness, the polarization of our societies, all because the algorithms actually survive on creating that polarism. That's how we get attention. If people are incensed about something, they come back and watch things. So an entire system that is like ripped our society apart, that system is now the basis upon which we are moving into the next age, the AI age. Same companies, those $17 trillion of market cap who can buy out whatever innovation they want with that, own that system. So we need more than anything else to break that up system now, because if AI, you put all the harm that Web 2 has done and you take it into AI and you put it on steroids,
And
that is
quantum.
how you destroy humanity.
Yeah.
That's how you destroy humanity, right? So we need to decentralize AI now,
Okay.
and that's
I'm
why,
going to ask, what is the fight? So
kind of,
that is the call to action.
yeah, the fight is fix the internet, because we have to fix the internet as we move into the AI age, right? So that's what the book's about. Is about,
Yeah.
like, we need to actually rechange the platform, and the bottom line is we need to own our own data, right? Data is the oil, data is the function. The ownership of the data is what gave Google its power, what gives Facebook its power, right? And it's ultimately what will give them even more power in the AI age, because data is vital to the formation of generative AI. So owning your data, your data is your personhood. It is in the internet age, what you do online is who you are. So you need to own you, right? That's the key message of this book. And so at the end of the day, we need to build a structure in which people have control. And I actually think that is going to be the biggest unlocking of value we've ever seen. 20 years of Web 2 has produced no increase in productivity. Why? Because all the value has been captured by a small group rather than pushed out to the productive processes and businesses that need to use it. We haven't built useful things because the incentives have been misaligned behind that. But if we create an AI system in which individuals are able to express what they want with their data, with their choices, and we can unlock all this siloed information, and on the people's terms, that we set the terms, not them, we will do all sorts of incredible things. Or imagine all the things we could do in healthcare if we could unlock all that healthcare, because you and I own our data and we can contribute it at will under privacy preserving terms into a data pool that can now suddenly run algorithms over it and build fantastic mirror. You can't do that right now because they're not incentivized to do it. The data is sitting in the wrong place. So there's enormous that we could do. We could we basically get a fork in the road. We've got, one side it's dystopia and one side is utopia, and centralizing it all down these black box algorithms that are, Shoshana Zuboff matrix is the worst way to go. That will put us into dystopia. Open it all up, it's very different. And the Decentralized AI Society is the company or rather the not-for-profit that I formed, having left CoinDesk. We haven't really talked about CoinDesk. CoinDesk was the institution that I ran for 4 years after leaving MIT. And we did some interesting stuff, including breaking this big story of the collapse of FTX, and we won Loeb Awards, and that was fun. And then that got in the midst of the crypto bear market, CoinDesk went into trouble, and we got bought out, and I got laid off, and I'm not upset about that because I ended up doing what I wanted to do was explore this new era of decentralized AI. So the Decentralized AI Society is formed as a initially as an event series, and we realized that, you know what, we need to form something that is it gives the nascent builders of these systems a chance to fight against the big guys by allowing them to collaborate, come together, forge, reach standards, agree on new models, innovate together, and so forth. We are a community of people building what we think is the operating system for humanity, an AI world that is built around ownership of data, is decentralized compute. It is a self-sovereign identity system for the development of this most powerful of technologies.
You know what you are? A modern
What's
day
that?
Che.
No, I'm not. I'd have to want to die in the jungle if that were the
Well, no, you
case,
don't
and I'm
know, no, but the
I'm
passion
too
that you
soft
have
for that.
and that's a total full circle. We didn't realize what the connection is, but what you're saying there is much more important. It's not just a new company, it's not just a new project. It's fundamental, as you say,
Yeah.
dystopia or utopia.
Yeah.
Um,
It
wow,
is. We need to think about this about what it means to be human and what it means to be human being. What it means to be human cannot be, in my mind, separated from what it means to be humans in a society. Like we're not. It's not a cliche to say that no person is an island. It literally is the definition. Like you can't define yourself without relative to somebody else, right? So we just fundamentally need each other. And if we don't have systems that allow us to actually coordinate together, that without being manipulated by some other force, then then yes, humanity is in deep, deep trouble. So yes, it is almost an ideology, but it's not a religion. It's a pro technology, but also sort of pro democracy and pro humanity way of thinking about what the future should look like.
call to arms. Wow. I have to go
Yeah,
back and read all those books now.
well,
It's costing me a fortune.
well,
Oh dear.
it,
That
it,
That is, I loved that. I absolutely loved our conversation. And I love the fact that went round. I mean, you are like a modern day Che Guevara.
He was
You
a
are.
writer as well, Che. He was, it's funny. I'm on the fence about Che Guevara, which means, which is strange. Most people are. They either love him or hate him. I don't really. I think he probably was, and I certainly don't believe in violence, and I certainly don't believe that he was, he told a good story. He was a good looking guy, and he was able to inspire a lot of people, sometimes to do crazy, stupid things. Um, but I do think that the idea that there's a calling to something bigger, which is certainly the message that he had, whether you like what that calling was or
In
not,
purpose.
is important. Yeah.
Having a purpose. I really, really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
Really,
It's
really. And
great.
it's actually,
Thanks for having me.
yeah, it's given me a lot of food for thought.
Mm.
Especially the fight that we're embarking on now. I feel a bit as if I'm in, I don't know, one of those Game of Thrones scenes. We're going to head
Uh,
off and fight the
yeah.
baddies or something. No, fascinating. Oh wow! I
Okay.
wish you every success with Deus. Um,
Thank you so much.
and
Thank
it's
you. I
going to
appreciate
be it's events, but it's going to be more than events now. Just tell me a bit
Yeah, so
briefly
so
about
you
the
know, it's
business
an
end.
organization that allows, and it's a decentralized structure. So we'll have it's we're not in charge. We pull it together. There will be a governing body that decides what to do.
Mm.
But we do say that like there's a lot of big challenges. So there's work that will be done around policy. We need policy structures that are friendly to decentralized models. There's work that needs to be done on radically changing the capital raising model that we have. At the moment, I think the incentive structure that runs out of venture in Silicon Valley is part of the problem. We're all geared towards all the wrong incentives. So how do we raise money for all these innovators to get without like ending up in the pockets of the wrong people, which ultimately means would just be every innovation will be bought out by the big seven. Um, and then there's engineering challenges, distributed machine learning and all of that is actually not very easy. It's doable, but it's extremely complicated. And so let's figure out how we do that together. And then there's just this huge education piece. We want the world to understand what decentralized AI is and why it actually matters. So, um, there's an outreach, there's a bridge building. I'm actually going to that horrible place, Davos, in 2 weeks' time, and we expect, we'll be putting on an event there, and part of the message there is to try to get mainstream companies to know that they themselves are victims in this process, right? Like their data needs to be protected and used in a constructive way. It's not just individual data; it's also business ideas and everything else. Everybody is beholden to those big seven, right? So we need to get everyone to recognize that the way forward is to decentralize this AI, and that's the educational piece that Deus is all about.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for your time. That has been very, 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 very interesting and
That's
thought-provoking. Thank you
I
indeed.
appreciate that, Jillian. Thank you so much for having me.